Welcome back to Caffeinated Dragonware. I'm Lisa, and over the past month, my boyfriend Stanley and I have been working on a game called Exit Stage Left, a mobile game where you play as a stage hog trying to stay on stage as long as possible. Today I'm going to add enemies to the game and have them push the player off stage. Before I get into it, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. We publish videos every Saturday. Before we begin, I'd like to give another shout out to Alexander. I found his videos especially helpful during this part of Exit Stage Left. Following his enemy spawning tutorial, I created a script that creates enemies using an invisible hidden spawner located in the middle of the stage. The script tells the spawner how many enemies to create, which type of enemy to use, how often to create them, and which side of the stage to use, alternating between left and right each time. Much like in the last devlog, there were a lot of duplications. To correct this, I used an if statement that would check to make sure that no more than 2 of the same enemies spawned in a row.
Basically, if the computer quote-unquote flips a coin and it lands on guy, and no more than 1 guy or 2 girls in a row are currently on stage, then the computer is told to create a male enemy, and add another tally to the guys in a row counter, and reset the girls in a row counter down to 0, take note of which side the enemy was quote-unquote born on, and keep track of how many enemies are on stage. And basically, all of this applies the same way if the computer quote-unquote flips a coin and it lands on girl.
Great, now we have enemies. But rather than have them stand there menacingly, I wanted to have them rush at the player from behind the curtains. Easier said than done. As I got to work correcting this and following a few tutorials, I encountered a handful of glitches. Everything from enemies not moving, growing in size, changing which direction they faced, moving backwards, or bouncing into the stratosphere. I still have no clue why they bounced. It just happened. Finally, following another one of Alexander's tutorials, you know what? Let me just... Good. Done. Awesome. Anyways... As instructed by the tutorial, I created 2 invisible points. One on the left side of the stage, and the other on the right. I created a script that uses these points to move the enemies from one side of the stage to the other. So if an enemy spawned on the right side of the stage, it would move towards the left point. If an enemy spawned on the left side of the stage, it would move towards the right point. They would also turn around when they got to the other side of the stage. This of course created 2 problems, namely there being way too many enemies on stage at once, and of course, rather than shoving the player, they would just sort of mob there and trap the player. First I tackled the lack of cooperation amongst the enemy ranks. Disappointed in you guys! And came up with a number of solutions such as having all the enemies turn left when one of them hits the player. But it's super lame. Using a variable to keep track of where each enemy spawned and having them turn to match the direction of the enemy that hit the player. Spoiler alert! That one didn't work half the time since the number would change every single time an enemy spawned. Why did I ever think this was a good idea? And then I had the brilliant idea of making a list of all of the enemies in play and where they originally spawned. This solution proved way too complex, and it still wouldn't determine which one hit the player, thus defeating the purpose. Eventually I settled on a simple solution. Following this tutorial by BurgZerg Arcade. Side note, this guy reminds me of my favorite uncle. Know my favorite real-life uncle? Following his tutorial, I used the player's hitbox to detect which direction the enemy was going. Now if the enemy hit the player while traveling to the right, all of the enemies would move to the right, or if the enemy hit the player while traveling left, all of the enemies would move left. Perfect. No more tug of war. Push of war? Anyway, the enemies are finally cooperating. Next I worked on figuring out a way to despawn enemies once they reach the opposite side of the stage. I used that variable I mentioned before. You know, the one that I used to keep track of where enemies spawned and that didn't work. However, later I transitioned to a list. So now when an enemy reached the opposite side of the stage, the first entry on the list would be used for validation. So the enemies know they're doing a great job and I'm proud of them. Oh yeah, and it also tells them not to vanish the instant they're created. You know, which helps. Then the enemy would be destroyed and the first entry of the list would be removed since the computer doesn't need to keep track of that anymore. Pfft, no use taking stock when they've been annihilated from reality itself. So many lives lost in the great beta testing war of 2020. While I was working on despawning, I noticed another issue with the enemies. If the player successfully dodged them and they crossed paths with another enemy traveling in the opposite direction, they would get stuck. At first I made it so the enemies can go through each other. However, if the player is standing still and two enemies are pushing him, it winds up looking like they're absorbing each other like some kind of hideous blob monster. I didn't like this at first because it looked weird, and I liked the cartoonish mob. However, none of the fixes I tried worked. In the end, this ended up not being an issue since the enemies would follow the player off stage anyways and would never cross paths. With all that taken care of, what's a game without a loss condition? So I created a game over script which acted like the god of my game. It had a special variable that could stop the user from controlling the player, stop enemies from spawning, and ensure enemies traveled in the same direction. This all-powerful variable was accessible by all of my scripts, and each one of them would constantly check to see if it was activated. If the great god of the game was asleep, all will be well with the world, continuing on as normal. However, should the player become hit, the god variable would awaken, and bring about the end of the world. The game world. Basically, it's a game over variable. However, there's one issue with the system. If the player lands on the enemy's head and falls off, landing behind the enemy, the God variable would activate, but the crowd would walk off, leaving the player behind. He would be forever alone, helpless, condemned to a quiet, horrifying existence of utter emptiness and existential dread. If any of you have any suggestions on how to fix that, please let me know in the comments. Now with that taken care of, I decided to clean up the player spawn system. You see, up to this point, both versions of the character, the brother and the sister, were on screen at the same time, one set to invisible and one set to visible. Using the same method I used for the enemy spawn system, and a very similar script, I got the player to spawn, and after working out a few bugs, using a condition, I told the computer to first check to see if the player was spawned. Then if they weren't, the computer would spawn the player. If, however, the player was spawned, the computer had to wait like a good little child until the player was gone before spawning the player back in. Now even though this had the same effect as having both characters start out invisible and making one of them visible, this new method was much more flexible. Now for example, if I wanted to add new characters, I could put them in a folder instead of dragging them on screen and making sure they're in the right spot and creating a custom script and attaching it to them. So to recap, players now have enemies to dodge, the enemies cooperate, and the player gets pushed off stage when hit, and I even updated the player spawn system. Not too shabby, all things considered. If you liked this video, be sure to drop a like and subscribe for more content like this. We upload every Saturday, so be sure not to miss us. Until next time, bye guys.